Well, I asked Alexander to put up a slide of a bridge, but I didn't realize that was going to be it. Anybody that takes that bridge is crazy. I don't know if that's one of the train or not, but um, so I'm going to talk about bridging and bonding today, and I'll tell you why. Most of you know that I go to a men's group on Tuesday morning called Masters Men. And in the last couple of weeks, Jordan has been talking about bridging and bonding. And he had a slightly different context than what I'm going to use today, but it hit me that bridging and bonding is something that the church kind of describes the church in a lot of ways. So let me kind of set the stage for you today. He used an article from Christianity Today to talk about our men's group, but also kind of Christianity in general. I realized that there are applications for us, and I wanted to kind of spend some time with them. So here's how this kind of came about. He was working off of an article in Christianity Today called Why the American Church Can't Fix Loneliness. And the article was written by a man by the name of Russell Moore, who some of you might know. He's the editor-in-chief. Christianity Today is a Christian magazine, mostly online anymore, as most magazines are. But he also has a PhD from Southern Baptist Theological Society. So you probably know, you may have heard of the name before. To make his point, he went back to a book that was written in 2000. And the reason he went back there is because there's been kind of a resurgence of this book. There may have been a second edition done more recently, but there's been quite a bit of press about the book. The book is titled Bowling Alone: The Collapse and Revival of the American Community. Now, you might think, that seems a little strange, bowling alone. Well, Robert Putnam wrote the book, and he was a political scientist. He wrote it in 2000. And his point was how Americans were becoming more and more and more isolated than they had ever been before. Think about that for just a minute. If you picture a bowling alley, don't you picture a bunch of people there who have something in common, that are having a great time together, that are kind of bonding? His point was that's not happening in our society anymore. If he wrote that in 2000, what do you think it is like today? First of all, you probably won't find any kids who know what a bowling alley is. But his point was that we are becoming more and more and more isolated. So while he was dealing with loneliness, and that's something the church needs to deal with, we're going to deal with it from a slightly different perspective. According to Putnam, though, the fix for what was going on then and the fix for something going on now was something he called social capital. And when I first looked at that, I thought, what in the world is social capital? So I looked up the definition that he had for it, and I'm going to read it to you because this is his definition. I don't want you to think I'm smarter than I am. I know you can't possibly think that, can you? The networks of relationships among people who live and work in a particular society, enabling that society to function effectively. That's what he called social capital. And he says it comes in two forms. The first is bonding. Social capital is made up of the ties that link people together who are like themselves. That's where we're the most comfortable, isn't it? He called that bonding. And that's one type of social capital. But he talked about another one. He talked about bridging. Bridging as social capital exists of the ties that link people to those unlike us. So he said the cure for loneliness, or the cure for what's going on in the world today, is a healthy mix of bonding and of bridging. Okay? Well, he was dealing with loneliness and isolation, and there are issues in the church, but I want to address two of what I call critical functions in the church on the same level, and that's this. I'm going to use different words for them, but it's the same thing. Edifying and evangelizing. Edifying is building up the church from within. Evangelizing is going out. It's the same concept, isn't it? It's bonding and it's bridging. They're big words, but they have pretty simple meanings. As I said, edifying is just building up. That's bonding. Evangelizing is just sharing the gospel with the outside. That's bridging. So now we have kind of a background for what we're going to talk about. I want to go back into the Bible. What a great place to go for a sermon, don't you think? The end of the Bible. I want to go back to the Bible and use a couple of examples for us to typify what it is that I think Putnam was talking about and what bridging and bonding is all about. Here's the first place I want to go. And you're going to think, this is a very strange place to go. Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. If you want to be in the book of Daniel, we're going to be in chapters 2 and 4. First of all, let me give you the backstory. About 600 years before the time of Christ, Babylon had become the supreme power in the world. Well, in the known world. In the meantime, God is in the process of correcting his people Israel, and in this case, his people Judah, the southern kingdom. So in 605 BC, the Babylonians are threatening the southern kingdom of Judah. When they do, they're coming into Jerusalem, or they're coming into Judah and will eventually end up in Jerusalem. The first thing that happens is a young Jewish man by the name of Daniel is captured and he's taken into captivity. That's where we get the book of Daniel from. He's the writer of the book. Most people would put him maybe between 15 and 17 years of age when he's carried into captivity in Babylon. Kind of the next pieces of the puzzle is in 598, a few years later, Ezekiel, also the writer of the book of Ezekiel, is going to be taken into captivity as well. Now they're both in Babylon. Finally, in 586, Jerusalem falls. It's Nebuchadnezzar who causes all these things. He's the one who's in power when all of these things happen. So Daniel has been called into service in the king's court. So now Daniel, a 16 or 17-year-old kid, is going to be called into service in the court of the most powerful man in the world at that point. A little intimidating, don't you think? So Daniel is put in a position of being kind of a consultant to the king. But up to this point, I'm not sure the king even knows who he is. He's really pressed into a tough role when he is the one, the only one, that can do something very strange that the king has asked for. The king says, you know what? I'm bringing all my advisors in here, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to interpret a dream for me. He says, but first, tell me what I dreamt. Then you can interpret it. All of these great advisors say, nobody can do that. Nobody can tell you what you dreamt and then give you the interpretation. You tell us the dream, and we'll tell you the interpretation. So Nebuchadnezzar, who was always a rational individual, says, off with their heads. Not just theirs, but also Daniel's. So Daniel is pressed into telling, going before the king, and to telling him what the dream is. That brings us to bridging. Think through this for just a minute. You got a 15 to 17-year-old Jewish kid who's brought into the court of the highest power in the world at the time, who probably doesn't even know who he is, and yet he's the one who's going to go before the king, and here's what he's going to say. Daniel replied, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you are lying on your bed are these. And then Daniel says, here's what you were dreaming. Not only that, but here's what the interpretation is. Nebuchadnezzar's flummoxed. He's going, how can this possibly be? Because Daniel has just got through telling the king what you dreamt was, first of all, the fall of your kingdom, then the fall of the Medes and Persians that follow you, then the fall of Alexander the Great, then the fall of the Romans. All of that's years ahead. But Daniel says, that's your dream. It was his dream, and Nebuchadnezzar is nonplussed. The last piece of that puzzle, by the way, is sometime in the future, Jesus is going to take care of all of this. That was the dream. All Daniel had to do was kind of figure out what it was that the king had dreamed and then explain it to him. Well, so pretty remarkable when you think about it, what's happening here. So what was the result? Well, in Daniel, we get the result as well. Then after he tells them all of what's happened, then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. A 17-year-old kid is now the prime minister to a nation that spans from Iran to the Mediterranean, down to Egypt, including Israel, the largest nation in the world. This is a 17-year-old kid. Well, you might think this is the beginning of bonding, and perhaps it was, but we're not through with his dreams yet. We're not through with Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. Nebuchadnezzar has another dream sometime later on. And so who does he go to? Daniel, right? And he says, here's my dream. And he tells him what the dream is. Nebuchadnezzar, in the dream, Nebuchadnezzar would become a wild animal and live away from mankind for 7 years. And here's what Daniel says. He tells him the dream, and he says, first of all, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't know that it's him. He just knows that he sees this vision of a wild animal out in the dew and eating grass, and etc. Here's what Daniel says. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal till 7 times pass by for him. And then Daniel says, it's you. It's you, Nebuchadnezzar, that's going to be in this role. Well, Nebuchadnezzar may not believe him at the point. In fact, according to the book, it says about a year later, Nebuchadnezzar's walking in his grounds and he goes, man, I'm kind of the coolest thing that's ever happened. I'm the knees bees. I'm the best thing since sliced bread. And guess what happens? Boom. Exactly what Daniel said from the word of the Lord happens. 7 years later, exactly what Daniel prophesied comes to a conclusion. So what's the result? I want you to listen to what happens in the last part of the chapter. At the end of that time, this is the 7 years, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. So what was the result? Now we can talk about some bonding. Nebuchadnezzar, to my way of thinking, and there's nobody that can convince me otherwise, just got through claiming that the Lord Yahweh was king of all. Now, was he a believer? The language kind of indicates that, but let me give you another kind of place to touch base, and that's this. In Jeremiah, when God says to Jeremiah, this is going to be years after Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's died. Jeremiah is prophesying just before the fall of Jerusalem, so call it 586. Jeremiah says 3 times when he's given the prophecy of God, God calls Nebuchadnezzar my servant. You don't think some bonding took place? If nothing else, I think you'd have to say that Nebuchadnezzar was at least a henotheist. At least he believed that there was one supreme God and maybe many others. But you also have to think about something else. What did all the Jews who were in captivity under Nebuchadnezzar think when he said, this is the Most High God? They finally have some hope that things are going to change for the future. So now we saw bridging, didn't we? Daniel certainly didn't have to go tell the dream. He certainly didn't have to go before the most powerful man in the world. That's bridging. And then we just saw bonding. And the bonding is, he says, that's my Lord and God. And Nebuchadnezzar says, that's my Lord and God. bridging and bonding. How about a second one? Let's talk about Jesus and the Samaritan woman. Now, a little backstory here. John in chapter 4 tells that Jesus is going to meet with the Samaritan woman. First of all, it's the only place you're going to find it is in John. I believe that's correct. If it isn't, then blame Deborah. There are some remarkable things that happen about this. And it's remarkable for three reasons. Here's the first. Samaritans were half-breeds. Samaria was between Galilee and Jerusalem. So it's halfway between the two, still in Israel. But they were half-breeds. Around 722, the Assyrians, even before the Babylonians, came in and conquered that area. And they took all the Jews into captivity. You know how they did it? Have you ever heard the term hook through the nose? That's exactly what they did. They ran like a fish hook through the nose or the lip of all of those, and then they strung them together. I want you to think about that. What happens if the guy in front of you falls? This is not going to be a fun trip, is it? So the first thing is the Assyrians came in and they took all the Jews out of the land. Then they resettled it with Assyrians from outside Judah. Over a period of time, they began to adopt some of Judaism, and they intermarry with some of the Jews that were left. So Jews of the day and Samaritans were at odds with each other. In fact, to the point that they didn't even want to talk to each other. That's the first remarkable thing. Here's the second remarkable thing. Normally, you wouldn't go through Samaria to get to Jerusalem. Jesus at this point is up in Galilee. You would not go through Samaria for that very reason. You know what you do? You would cross the Jordan River, and you would go down on the east side of the Jordan River and then back into Jerusalem. So it was remarkable that Jesus even took the path of going through, and his disciples didn't want him to. Here's the third remarkable thing. In John's gospel, this is the first recorded conversation of a Gentile with Jesus. More importantly, this is the first time that Jesus reveals himself to anybody as the Messiah. And who is it to? A Samaritan woman. Now, let's talk about bridging for a minute. Now, he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town, this is from John chapter 4, came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." First of all, Jesus didn't have to go through Samaria. I just got through telling you, he could have gone the other route. He did not have to go through Samaria. Here's the second thing. He waited for this woman to show up at the well. Nobody ever came to get water at the well at noon. It was the hottest time of the day. No one else would have been there. The reason she was there, she was an outcast even from the Samaritans. So the first thing is, he didn't have to be there. Secondly, he certainly didn't have to wait for her at the well. And here's the third thing. Did you notice what I said a minute ago? He sent the disciples into town. Jesus then goes on to tell the woman everything that has happened in her past that only the Messiah could know. So what's the result? She leaves her water jar. She tells everyone in Sychar, "This is the Christ." You know what we just saw? Bonding. First we saw bridging, didn't we? Jesus going through this area to begin with. That's bridging. It's Jesus reaching out to somebody that normally a Jew wouldn't even talk to. That's bridging. And then the bonding, Jesus says, let me tell you about your life and let me tell you about living water. And the living water is me. That's the bonding. Let me leave you with one other thought on this Samaritan woman. Church history, especially the Orthodox Church, believes this woman went on to become one of the best missionaries there ever was. The Orthodox Church celebrates someone called Saint Fitoni. And that's who they believe was the Samaritan woman. So we went from, I hate you, to bridging to bonding. Does everybody follow me? Well, good, because I want to go on to a different kind of bridging and bonding. So far, our bridging and bonding has been with new believers, right? Nebuchadnezzar was not a Baptist. The Samaritan woman, as far as she knew, whatever the Jews believed was completely foreign. So we've talked about bridging and bonding with believers. I want to talk about bridging and bonding among Christians. It's going to get a little more personal now, isn't it? Talking about how we bond with each other. And I want to use 1 Corinthians as kind of a backstory for it. You people have heard me say a number of times that the Corinthian church was something called a recalcitrant church. Recalcitrant means stubbornly resistant to authority. I've become very familiar with that teaching freshmen in high school. This was what you would call a recalcitrant church. It's probably one of the church that I would say Paul had the most trouble with. And in the very first part of the book, Paul is going to deal with, here's what's going to happen in the very first part of the book. Here's what Paul's going to say in 1 Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, I could not address you as people who live by the Spirit, but as people who are still worldly, mere infants in Christ. I gave you milk, not solid food, for you are not ready for it. Indeed, you are still not ready. You are still worldly. For since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere humans? For when one says, I follow Paul, and another says, I follow Apollos, are you not mere human beings? What Paul's doing is he's taking the very first issue he deals with, and that's what? Divisions within the church. This is divisions within people who are already said Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior. It happens as early as 1 Corinthians, and then that's one of Paul's first visits. He's taking on this division in the church, and he said, there's Apollos and there's Paul, and he pulls all of them together, and he makes the case that Paul planted the seed, Apollos watered, but it was God who made the crops grow. Well, fortunately, this is the Corinthians, 2,000 years ago. It had nothing to do with the church today. Does it? Aren't we sometimes really comfortable in our own group? Don't we sometimes say, well, those other guys, they don't do the offering the way we do the offering, or they don't sing the songs we sing, or they do the Lord's Supper differently. How is that any different than what Paul had to address in the Corinthian church? So Paul has to do what? Paul has to go through a process of bridging and bonding, even within the church. And let me show you how he does it. Let's see. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians 3:16, and then I'm going to skip to 21:23. Here's what he says. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and God's Spirit dwells in your midst? So the first thing he does is bridge these two groups back together and say, don't you know that you are part of God's final plan, and that your responsibility is to work in this final plan? And then he goes on and says this. So then, by the way, when Paul says so then, it's kind of like saying, therefore, no more boasting about human leaders. All things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all are yours. And you are Christ, and Christ is of God. You don't think that's bonding? First, he pulls them all together and he says, you know what? We're all together as this group, and now we're going to bond together because the cement that bonds us together is right here. And you are Christ, and Christ is of God. Well, that kind of brings me to my favorite part of a sermon. So what? What does all this have to do? It's all pretty good history, isn't it? Kind of fun history. What does this have to do? 4 things. Do with us, that is. What does it have to do with bridging and bonding? 4 things. Here's the first. Bonding cannot occur unless bridging happens first. Are you following me? I want you to think about that for just a minute. What if Daniel had never made the overture to Nebuchadnezzar? What if Jesus had never made the overture to the woman at the well? There would never have been bridging to begin with. Without that bridging, neither one of them could have gone on to lead that person to Christ. All right? So the first thing is, bonding cannot occur unless bridging happens first. Bridging happens first. Here's the second. The result of bridging and bonding is greater than the sum of its parts. Well, what does that mean? Well, if bridging and bonding had not occurred, Nebuchadnezzar and the Samaritan woman never would have seen the salvation. Right? Here's the third thing. As a church, we often focus on bonding to the detriment of bridging with our fellow Christians, don't we? We get comfortable. I get comfortable. I'm comfortable with things I know, the things I can do. I'm uncomfortable with things that I have difficulty doing or I find trouble doing, even if that means finding someone else who doesn't know the word of Christ or finding someone in the church that thinks a little differently than I do. So bonding cannot occur unless bridging happens. The result of bridging and bonding is greater than the sum of its parts. And thirdly, as a church, we often focus on bonding to the detriment of bridging with fellow Christians. Ecclesiastes talks about that. You know what Ecclesiastes says? A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. 3 strands is not only bridging, it's bonding, isn't it? And let me give you the 4th. Bonding is comfortable. It's easy. Easier. But when bonding occurs without bridging, the opportunity to spread the gospel is stifled and the church stagnates. So where do we leave all of this? Well, here's the only place I can think to leave it. Perhaps it's time we get uncomfortable. Father God, thank you for the day and your hand upon it, Father. I pray, Father, you would continue to guide us, show us your ways, Father. Help us, Father, to bridge and to bond, Father. Help us to carry your message, Father, not just those who have yet to hear it, Father, but to share it with those who have heard it, Father, and share it in joy with them. And I pray these things in your name. Got to put my other hat on.
Sorry. Our final hymn this morning, our closing hymn, is on page 300, Jesus, Lord to Me.